I'm here to share with you a story that changed the entire trajectory of my spiritual path. It's an experience that arguably reshaped my entire way of thinking, and is probably the reason I became so fascinated with the world of demons and spirit contact. If you're new to my channel, I am an occultist and a student of the hidden sciences, and everyone who endeavors to have a spiritual practice will see it evolve over time. Your methods change, your practice changes, your beliefs change, and above all else, you will change, as a person, and as a witch. I knew that, but I wasn't expecting something like this to happen, which would radically change my area of interest. I didn't wake up one day and decide to become a demonologer or a Satanist, but still, this path found me. A few years ago, I discovered an abandoned cement factory some 40 minutes from where I lived. As a fan of forlorn and haunted places, I was naturally drawn to it. Abandoned places have always been one of my favorite settings for ritual activity. The energy is always so much more intense and accessible. The fabric of reality just seems so much more malleable, and the rituals seem so much more potent in these places. I think the energy is so intense in part because of the many stories left behind in these places, compounded by the traffic of other explorers and vandals and passerby who add their own energies into the mix. It makes for a special kind of paranormal cocktail, if you will. But of all the haunted places I've explored, this was different. I had heard rumors about this place. It's barely documented, virtually unheard of from those outside the area, but nonetheless the locals feared this place. There were stories of awful things happening here. Violent acts, deaths, murders even, satanic rituals. A place where people went to do bad things. It was a known hotspot for shadow figure sightings. So many unusual things happen in that place, as the locals will swear by. Voices tend to call out from the dark, strange noises, cars breaking down, people getting lost. So naturally, my morbid curiosity got the better of me, and I took the drive. I remember feeling a sudden shift in the air the moment I turned down that dirt road, a strange heaviness in the atmosphere. From the very second I took my first step out of that car, I felt like I was on another planet, like something between the real world and somewhere else. There was this immense heaviness and a strange silence in the air that can't be explained until you feel it. Everything stood completely still. No animals, no birds, not even wind. It was like the place was frozen in time. Everything was so still that I almost expected something to move, because it felt like every inch of me was being watched. I took some time to explore. There were multiple buildings on the abandoned campus. The main building fell victim to a concrete spill at one point, which had turned the lower level of the building into basically a chain of caves. The concrete had formed walls and slopes with stalagmites on the inside that gave it an almost cavernous feeling. I chose this area to perform my ritual. Using the power of Hecate, I planned to stir the local spirits so that I could communicate with them and learn more about this place. At this time in my life, so many years ago, and only just beginning my spiritual journey, I was not as well versed in proper ritual magic or demonology. I knew the classical methods of conjuring, methods I've since discarded, and I wasn't a very mature practitioner at the time. I was aloof and unserious, and just wanted to kick this hornet's nest. And so I set on this task of stirring those local spirits with a rather unpracticed mindset. It was dark. The sun had just set, and I took my lantern, a backpack, and a small table and went into the concrete cave. I set up a small and crude circle of tea-light candles around my table, which seems laughable now, and the table I used to hold a flaming dish that I used as the focal point of this ritual. Around me were several large open doorways peering into other rooms of the factory. It was almost like I was standing in a crossroads between 5 or 6 different paths. I began by casting my circle of protection and laying down a few rudimentary safety measures. Then I set into a period of incanting over the area, using various Hebrew and Greek words I learned from occult grimoires and ancient texts that were designed to attract spirits. I won't go too deep into the specifics of the ritual, that's besides the point of the story, but I used various methods to pull spirits closer to me and thin the veil of perception just a little bit more so that they could interact with me. I rang bells, used chants, and used a bowl of flames to scry and fire gaze. I was expecting most of my communication with the spirits to be done through the fire, but I was wrong. To my right somewhere, in another room, on the other side of the concrete wall, I heard a noise. My first thought was, well, shit, somebody's here, I gotta run. I was dressed in a ritual robe and standing in a circle of candles after all, and trespassing all the while. But I listened, and that's not what that sound was. It started small, but got closer and closer. The sound of metal on the ground, scraping like a sheet of metal was being dragged across the concrete. It got closer and closer and closer. Then I noticed the temperature of the room dropping suddenly to ice cold, to the point my fingertips hurt. Then in that doorway, just beyond the light of my candles, 2 small dots were looking back at me. They were like those dots you see in the bushes when you shine a light on a hiding animal. Out from the darkness of that doorway, suddenly came movement. A black silhouette, a figure whose outline I could only just barely trace from the dim light of the fire. But it was tall. I'm 6'4" and I was looking up at it, to give you an idea. And before you say anything, no, I had not ingested any drugs or altering substances beforehand. And although I've experienced visible spirits before during trance, truly I was not that entranced in this moment, and the sight of this thing quickly spooked me out of any trance I would have been in to begin with. For so long, despite my belief in spirits, they were always more of an idea than something that could stand in front of you, in the flesh. But this thing was definitely in front of me. Not wavering like some kind of vision or hallucination, but truly in front of me as if I could reach out and grab hold of it. When it peered out from the doorway, I could see that it had a tall body with elongated limbs and broad shoulders. The head was enormous and oddly shaped. I can't quite describe the actual shape of it or what it might look similar to. The closest thing my mortal mind can think of to compare it to would be the head of a bull, but it only narrowly comes close. But I stood in total silence for the longest time, just staring at this thing, and it stared back. I think for a while we were both trying to figure out what each other were. The staring went on for so long. And then for whatever reason, I started to panic internally. Not thinking clearly, breathing shallowly, and heart rapidly speeding out of my chest. I felt as if I was losing control of this interaction. This is where I fumbled things terribly. Fearing the entity was growing too strong for me to handle, filling me with dread to weaken me. I remembered back on the rather shaky ritual knowledge I had at the time, and began using the Hebrew god names to assert control over the situation and regain my bearings. That was a horrible move on my part. The thing seemed immediately pissed off, a strange sound suddenly booming from it, kind of like a roar. Looking back, it reminded me of those moments from childhood, standing outside the lion's habitat at the local city zoo and feeling the force of the lion's roar shaking everything around me. The floor, the walls, my chest, my very bones. All of it thundered with this roar. So I stood there crying and holding my ears shut, trying to shout Hebrew over this thing that was roaring so loud it felt like the building might collapse over me. Eventually it stopped. There was a return to that same eerie silence. I looked back up at that silhouette with its amber-red glinting eyes, looking almost like the burnt ends of cigarettes in the dark. And then slowly, the figure backed into the door it came through and dissolved back into the dark. I stood there for a few more minutes, nearly pissing myself and unable to comprehend what just happened. I grabbed my things, put out the candles in the fire, and made like hell out of that building. There was a long walk from the building down to where my car was parked. A narrow trail was cut through the shoulder-high weeds that surrounded the building. You had to go through this one specific trail to get back to the one place you could physically park, which was a dusty plot of broken asphalt, gravel, and dust. I held a lantern and tried to make my way in the pitch black, with no outdoor lights or any sign of civilization for miles around. I didn't even have much light from the sky. I searched and searched, swinging that lantern just about everywhere I could swing it to try and find that path. It felt like I scrambled in circles for 20 minutes or more in pure panic mode. The more I scrambled, the more it felt like I was not alone in those weeds. I kept feeling things next to me, like someone was walking alongside me. I would even hear footsteps right next to me and shine my light over just to see nothing. Finally, I found the trail, cut through the weeds, found my car, and got the hell out of there. I sped off to a local restaurant back in town and sat in silence over my food as I tried to wrap my head around what happened. I think for anyone who is a serious practitioner, who can stay their path and really be a sort of spiritual explorer, you'll eventually experience something that I call the moment of knowing. It's the moment where you go from merely believing in something to knowing it is real. Depending what that something is, this moment can be life-changing. It's one thing to believe in the existence of spirits, even if you believe such a thing earnestly and with your whole heart. But it's another thing entirely to know something is real. Ancient peoples did not approach spirits like we do today. They did not think of them as something to be believed in. They simply knew spirits were real. It was a part of their reality, a part of their worldview and their understanding of how the world worked. Up until this point, I had experienced spirits, so that part wasn't new to me, but all of those experiences were confined to dreams, visions, ritual trance work, and out-of-body experiences. This was the first time I encountered a living spirit in full physical manifestation, and so it was quite a shock to my psyche, to put things mildly. Truth be told, this encounter felt as though it reshaped my entire perception of reality in the days and weeks following. And by now, you're probably sitting with the same burning question I was. What was the thing? I wouldn't truly find out until a few years later. There was a night this past spring where I hosted a small gathering in my home for some fellow witches. Among them was my mentor, a very seasoned witch who was herself a direct apprentice of Raymond Buckland, one of the big names in the world of Wicca. My mentor had brought over her Ouija board, a beautiful, handcrafted board embossed with Gothic artwork and a giant Baphomet in its center. To this day, it's the most gorgeous board I've ever seen. Anyways, I had never used a spirit board up to this point. I had always been so occupied studying deep ritual methods and historical texts that I admittedly stopped taking Ouija very seriously. We began, of course, by asking who was there. The planchette spelled out a name, one none of us had ever heard of before. Zadkiel. After a quick Google, we found that it was the name of an angel. Some accounts state that he is the angel who restrained Father Abraham when he went to slay his son Isaac in the name of God. However, it wasn't this simple. The board suddenly kept spelling the word fallen over and over again. We did some more questioning and came to the conclusion that this means exactly what it implies, a fallen angel. Although we have no way to truly verify according to literature or research if this angel may truly be fallen. My mentor suddenly gets a strong urge that the spirit wants to talk to me. She asks if it's a spirit I know or have encountered before, and the board says yes. I barely ever work with angels, and when I do, they are usually exclusively of the fallen variety, but I'd never worked with a Zadkiel before, to my knowledge. So my mentor asked where I had met this spirit, and the board spelled mill. What mill? I asked. The board then spelled factory, and my heart froze. Surely this wasn't the spirit I met that night. Wasn't the spirit I encountered some form of demon? I did some more research and found that Zadkiel presides over the planet Jupiter. And what does Jupiter represent but the zodiacal sign of Taurus? A bull. And as I said before, the thing looked vaguely bull-headed. After an hour or more of questioning, we determined that the spirit was stuck in that place and bound there. It denied that a human had by any means of witchcraft bound it to those grounds, so I asked if instead a demon had bound it there, and it said yes. I wasn't ready for the response I got after that. When I asked what demon was holding Zadkiel there, the board below our planchet literally started to move independently of our touching, but it turned in a swift counterclockwise motion on the table. Moving rather erratically, the planchet suddenly spelled the name, Belial. Looking back on this still gives me chills. Nobody else at that party knew the name Belial, as I was the only person there that was a true demonologer or Satanist. Zadkiel seemed to press the matter that he wanted me to come back to the factory. His response to my asking why was the board spelling, meet you. Of course, I'm not an idiot. If this truly was a fallen angel bound to that location by King Belial, I wasn't about to go freeing it or messing with things that ought not be messed with. As a Satanist, my allegiance is first and foremost to the infernal, and to King Belial in this situation. So I wasn't about to free someone Belial had captured. They were probably bound up for good reason. There of course were many details to the story I couldn't fit here for time's sake. I may revisit and shed more light some other time. But for now, the implications of this story leave me with so many things to consider, both for my practice and for how I perceive this ever-changing world of spirits. Thank you for watching. A few quick announcements before we end today's video. I would like to introduce the new official Cipher Grove website, which will soon be your all-in-one stop for my content. That is, aside from the exclusive content I provide for my Patreon supporters. If you enjoy this channel, please help me afford the means to create more episodes more often and consider supporting me on Patreon. I am trying to return to a reasonable upload schedule, and that is only made possible when I can afford to take extra time for production. Patreon supporters also have access to bonus content and blog posts that contain ritual instructions, methods of magic, and other useful pieces of research. Also, if your interests are more in the variety of receiving a tarot reading or spiritual consultation, you can book those on the new Cipher Grove website. As always, thank you to my Patreon supporters for their amazing help. More content is coming in addition to video courses, books, and so on. From one curious soul to another, I wish you well, and thank you for stopping by.